I'll just head into explaining what we're doing today here and introducing my colleague, Mike, which this is going to be a lot of fun to talk to Mike. So Mike is a Holacracy One partner, and he is also an experienced coach, but he actually came to Holacracy One after leading a Holacracy engagement in the Washington state government as the deputy CIO. So this was actually one of the first large-scale implementations, or was the first large-scale implementation of Holacracy in government. And it was the grounds for a research experiment on the effectiveness of Holacracy in partnership with the Harvard Business School. We have had some preliminary access to the results of those experiments, but they won't be released or published for a couple of years. But it was Mike has a lot probably to share about that experience. And he has a lot to share about leadership because he had to sort of go through the change himself and also kind of help his managers and lead links make that transition. And now as a Holacracy coach, he's working with some pretty large implementations, helping coaching people from the other side of that. And he's pretty fun too. So I think we should have a good time chatting for the next hour or so. And the concept of today, Mike, we had talked about sort of like leading in Holacracy, specifically on the leadership provided by Holacracy lead links and managers. Anything you want to add to context to give me a break from talking for a moment before I jump into questions?
Yeah, I think the one other key piece of information is that I'm not pregnant. And so, but I might still be out of breath from time to time.
Wonderful, thank you. That didn't help me catch my breath again because it made me laugh, but okay. So one place I want to start, Mike, is about sort of the importance of the lead link role. Something that I see, I fill a role called Holacracy Advisors, so do you. When I meet with newer potential clients, is there's a misconception that if I'm practicing the meetings, then I'm practicing Holacracy. If I'm running tactical meetings, I'm running governance meetings, then we're good to go on Holacracy. And if you read the Constitution, so little of it actually relates to the meetings, and there's a lot that's happening in the day-to-day life of the organization that relates to the power shift, and the lead link is so integral in that. So I'm wondering if, I mean, they can help the transition to Holacracy, they can also inadvertently undermine it, we've seen. So I'm wondering, could you just talk a little bit generally about the role of a lead link in the day-to-day work of a Holacracy-powered organization to set context, especially for the newer practitioners?
Yeah, I think, as I think about that, I think what's interesting about the lead link role is typically the lead link or the circle lead is the previous manager in the organization. And so there's a lot of work that is expected of the manager in terms of leading the organization, sort of setting the tone, creating the space for people to come together. And I think in Holacracy, I think there's a transition period where that's still a lot of the activity of the lead link. In reality, I think in the long run, it's actually not the lead link's accountability. But as most organizations are going through this transition, people still turn to that lead link to set the tone and sort of be a model. And quote, lead the circle. Although I should make clear that's actually not the accountability of that particular role. And I think you talk about the meetings, which is, there is, when you look at the Constitution, there's some chunks in the Constitution that talks about the format of the tactical meeting and as well as the governance, and it goes into a lot of detail, right? And when we attend the practitioner training, a lot of it is how do you effectively facilitate those meetings. And it's easy to come away with the perception that Holacracy happens in meetings, when in fact, actually that's maybe 10 or 20% of the activity. Holacracy is really about how we come together as a people and how we interact in all circumstances, and meeting is just one of those sort of venues. So I think the majority of how we come together and work as a group is actually outside of meetings. It's how we talk to each other in the hall and how we reach around the cube and ask a question and I think particularly with the lead link or the circle lead, if you're using the new version of Holacracy, it's a real challenge for them to learn the right ways to interact with people outside of meetings as well as in meetings. And in addition to that, it's not just the lead link that has a challenge, it's also, for us, the people, in terms of how do you interact with this person who used to be your manager and is now as a lead link. And how do you do it in such a way where you actually own the power that you now have, rather than continuing to sort of, give them the power. And this comes up in our language and how we talk, and it's part of the learning process. So, but I think most of the quote learning holacracy and how to interact with each other happens actually outside of meetings. Although you wouldn't know that from from attending practitioner training, perhaps, or some of the other things.
I'm so glad that you mentioned language, and I want to like maybe do a call out to Chris Cowan, who's another one of our colleagues and a master coach. And he's done a kind of a cool communications framework that we can send out to you guys after the fact. But a lot of what happens with holacracy in place is that these subtle patterns of language change, particularly between the manager and the former manager and the former employee. It becomes from, something that was a subtle kind of demand before, or get this on my desk by Monday morning, to a question, or and we'll talk more about the specifics of how this changed, or a pitch. A pitch is something you hear really, that we use a lot, which indicates like, you have the authority here. I know that you have the authority here, but I'm going to, push as hard as I can to kind of get you to hear my idea, knowing that at the end of the day, you'll use your authority. And those are things that maybe are not used as clearly in regular organizations, but once you transition to holacracy, you're going to have to start paying attention to those subtle patterns of language, because they become really important for understanding where the authority lies.
Yeah, and it's, you learn as you sort of go through the various training, leadership training in the hierarchical system, you learn the fact that what you say can be very powerful. And one of the challenges that senior leadership in particular have is they often can't really talk to regular people in organizations and have a conversation without what they're saying being interpreted as direction. And so it becomes a really nuanced thing. And as a leader, you have to be really careful in terms of how you talk to others, and like just having a conversation about some idea and not having it being perceived as as direction. And now in a holacracy context, that still, kind of applies until people really learn and own their authority. And so the language becomes really, really important. And it's I think the way I think about it, it's largely about demonstrating respect for other people's authority. And that's, it can be, the language can be very nuanced and subtle. I mean, it doesn't even have to be, deliberately directional. It can just simply be, hey, if you want to have, and I think this is really one of the hard pieces, is like as a leader, as a lead link, you still have the authority to request work of other roles. But how you do that is very important, and how you say that is very important, because it could be perceived as direction rather than as a request.
I have so many questions about that, and I want to hold on that, because we'll talk about the lead links accountability, prioritizations, projections. How do you do those? I think that's a key thing. We're not gonna be able to cover it all here, but let's touch on it. But I wanted to start by talking about, for you, when you were a leader in an organization outside of Holacracy One, kind of leading an organization through Holacracy and being the lead link of multiple teams, what were some of the challenges for you? And what was it like to lead before adopting Holacracy, and what was it like to lead after? And I know you have a handy little metric, like graphic, that you might like to show as well.
Yeah, I think I would characterize my leadership before Holacracy as a servant leader. I was a student at servant leadership. I read many books, been schooled on it and trained on servant leadership. And that's how I would characterize my leadership style at that time. And when it came to learning Holacracy, the real challenge for me was, it's like Holacracy happens, it's a sign of the Constitution, all of a sudden you're in a holacratic organization, although you have no idea what it means, and you have no idea like how to do all these things. And so as a leader, and what I observe in other leaders as well, is you kind of fall back to one of two behaviors. One behavior is you just continue to lead the way you've always done in a hierarchy. And the other behavior is you actually recede quite a bit in terms of direction and leadership out of fear. And that was sort of how I behaved, out of fear of like not being supportive of this new paradigm. Not sure what it is yet, but I want to be very supportive of it. And so both patterns are, perfectly natural and normal, and both patterns are equally wrong. And so the real challenge as a leader is, in Holacracy, is you still need to lead, but like, how do you do that? And there are mechanics, and leading is not the same as directing people. It's about being strategic in achieving the purpose of that team, and how do you go about doing that. And in fact, I wrote a blog post about this, which Matt can maybe link. It's called Leading in Holacracy. It's on Medium. So that identifies 4 main levers that I saw. And in fact, in Chris's leadership course, the LeadLink course, he goes into a lot of detail in these things. And so he goes even further than what I cover in my blog post. But I think that's really the first challenge, is learning how to actually use the system to lead in Holacracy without telling people what to do, without directing. And so that's probably the first part of that question. And did you have another part of the question though?
Well, I just remember you, after Holacracy, that you showed me at one point your dashboard that was like your swim lanes, I think, and how that changed for you in terms of like, at least if I remember you remember correctly, it was like you were able to shift your focus to more strategic projects because you were no longer putting yourself in the role of interceding, in every project request or directing every traffic direction, which is what managers so often end up doing.
Yeah, that was really my first aha moment as a leader, and to kind of set that up a little bit. Long before I learned about Holacracy, the way I managed my own workload was I had a whiteboard, and I used agile practices and Scrum and Kanban and those sort of things to sort of manage my own personal workload. And I had swim lanes. In fact, I think I have a picture of that, which I'll share here. And I use this to track my day-to-day work. And in my particular role as a deputy CIO for the state of Washington, I had responsibility to oversee about $4 billion a year in spend and lead essentially 4,000 IT workers. So in that particular role, most of my work is strategic. It's not necessarily operational. And let me share this screen here. So this is a one snapshot that I had back in the day. And essentially what I did is I had a swim lane of all the strategic activities, technology business management, which was about transparency and how the state spends its money, cloud adoption, agile. And I had this other swim lane at the bottom called other stuff. And I had a little quote there to remind me how to think about this, the swim lane. And the quote was, maximize what not to do, which means do as little as possible in here and try to avoid work in the swim lane, because it wasn't strategic, it was tactical work. And primarily my job is strategic. And I measured, like each of those cards you see is a chunk of work or an activity. And I actually measured that and sized it, is the agile term, so that I could see how I spent my time. And after a few months of doing this, I did an analysis, and I discovered that 90% of my time was spent in the other stuff. Only 10% of my time was actually in the strategic. And that was, a very depressing moment for me, being someone who really loves driving change and being strategic. Well, then we adopted Holacracy because of another initiative around some HR strategies that we're trying to implement. And I was still managing my work this way. But then after about 6 months of using Holacracy, the amount of time that I was able to spend on strategic initiatives went from 10% to 80%. So there was an 800% increase in my own capacity to work on strategic initiatives. And that was the beginning of, that was like the first data point that eventually led me to the conclusion that I'll never work in hierarchy ever again.
And then we snatched you for Holacracy 1. But I think that sort of like the point I want to emphasize there, especially for people that are newer, is that the strategic work isn't done from the LeadLink role. What happens in LeadLink is you have an accountability for structuring the governance of the circle to suit its purpose. I'm not sure what the exact accountability in GlassFrog is, but something along those lines. And you're constantly looking at creating new roles, updating new roles, and then another accountability for filling the right people in those roles. And that might be you. So I'm imagining, Mike, that in this situation, you had some other roles that you created that were strategic roles, and you were, filling yourself into those roles and driving work, so that 80% that you were doing was being driven from those strategic roles, and 10% of your time now is being done as a lead link. And I think, I mean, you can confirm or deny that and add nuance to it, but I think that part of the key shift here is that you shouldn't be spending so much time as a lead link. Maybe a newer circle, but in general, you know, there's not a lot of time. It's a more of a light touch kind of role.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's one of the first lessons that, you know, takes time to learn as you're making this transition from a manager to a circle lead or lead link, is that, you know, even, and actually what you see on the screen there is sort of reality, whether you're in holacracy or in a hierarchy. Even in a hierarchy, if you're leading a hierarchy, you're wearing multiple hats. And one of your hats is trying to figure out whether, you know, is the resources and whether you're structured properly. One of your other hats is around, you know, working on strategic, you know, initiatives for to serve your purpose or whatever. And the difference is in holacracy, you split those different hats out into different roles. And the lead link itself, that particular role, you know, is really just about, as you said, it's about structuring the circle to make sure it's achieving, you know, its purpose and accountabilities, and getting the right people in the right roles, and resolving, you know, prioritization sort of issues. But a lot of the actual execution and working on strategic initiatives is not the accountability of the lead link. And so way this manifested for me is that there was a role called Agile Advocate that I filled, and it was around advocating for, you know, Agile practices within state government and developing policies that, you know, reinforce that and that sort of thing. But those are different roles. And so to some extent, my work didn't really change. I was doing the same work. What really changed, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, what really changed was the other stuff. When I analyzed what was I doing, what was taking up so much of my time. And at the end of the day, what was taking up so much of my time is a big job of a servant leader is solving other people's problems.
Yeah.
And I realized I didn't need to do that anymore in a holacracy context. And because other people were empowered, and I have to solve other people's problems in the hierarchy because I am their one pathway to resolving those issues. But in a hierarchy, people have multiple other pathways.
No, it's true. But then I think there's also that kind of moment in time where people are looking to you for certain types of solutions, and you have to understand, it's that thing of like, which you mentioned at the beginning, how far do you lean in and how far do you step back? Because there are responsibilities of a lead link to offer guidance. And that's part of why that role exists as a fixed piece of the Constitution, is that it provides certain types of key leadership at key moments. You know, and maybe we could talk a little bit about what those are, you know, prioritizations, projections, or not projections, but prioritization strategies, how those change.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the guidance piece of it. So when we first made this transition, there were a couple of people who sort of tongue-in-cheek, but, you know, were expressing one of the frustrating changes for them as we're going through this, in which they would come to me and ask me a question. They want to get my advice on something. And I would ask them back, like, well, what role are you speaking to? And they found that very frustrating in the beginning. And for me, it was, you know, how I was trying to keep check of, okay, you know, am I really operating in this new paradigm, or am I operating in an old paradigm? And because often what they would do is they would ask questions, but really what they're really asking is permission. And having that awkward dialogue, you know, which role are you speaking to? Well, I'm speaking to his lead link role. Well, actually, the lead link role has no accountability for what you're talking about. And so just that short dialogue helped reinforce the fact that, you know, they have the authority to make these decisions. Now, sometimes they do want to come to me for advice. But when they're coming to me for advice, it's not in the lead link role. It's usually me as a person because of the experience that I have, you know, in the background or something. So the lead link doesn't really have that kind of, you know, accountability. Now, sometimes what I would do if the advice were frequent enough, like around budgeting, I created a separate role called budgeting coach to make it clear that, yeah, when you're asking me for budgeting sort of questions, you're really interacting with me in that role. And here are the authorities of that role. But it's not uncommon, of course, as you say, for people to come and ask the manager for advice. But as a manager, you have to help them and help yourself think through, Is it advice you're asking for, or is it permission? If it's permission, you actually have all the permission you need. If it's advice, then you're really not talking to me in the lead link role. You're talking to me as a person who has a lot of experience, and that's fine. And I can still give you advice. Now, your question around in terms of what are the accountabilities of the lead link?
Can I just pause one moment
yeah.
before you do that? Because just to add a little bit of, maybe practical advice, how to translate this into action. I think you can always ask people for advice as people, as a rule of thumb. If you find that there's this kind of constant need for a particular type of input, for a particular type of decision, that might be an indicator as a lead link that you want to create a new type of role for providing a particular type. I mean, within one of the circles where I'm lead link, we have a feedback role because that's needed for course creation. So anyway, just thinking about how you can enact that type of stuff and code it into governance from a lead link perspective, that's one little hack that you can use. Anyway, Mike, go back to what you were saying from the tools.
Yeah, you'd asked a little bit about like what is the real activity and role of the lead link in Holacracy or Circle Lead, and in the version 5 of Holacracy, it's even less. But in version 4.1, essentially your authority or accountability as a lead link is to make sure the governance of the circle is structured in a way that achieves its purpose and accountabilities. And so that's making sure you've got the right roles and the clarity is, that the clarity is there. And in terms of people knowing where work should go and where decision-making is. Another accountability you have is in assessing fit, putting partners in roles and assessing fit and providing feedback and on, how they can improve and enhance their fit. A third one is you have accountability around really dealing with prioritization disputes. So in Holacracy, each role has the authority to prioritize the work within that role, and each person has the authority to prioritize the work across all the roles. But every once in a while, within a circle, there may be conflict of what's more important. Is it A or B? Now, in reality, both are important, but sometimes we have to make a choice, and people have the the power to resolve that conflict themselves. But in the case where they can't, it's not really clear. They can ask the lead link for decision. Is A more important than B? And and then you just make those decisions. And the other accountability that's the lead link has, what you talked about a few times, Tara, is around the strategy and setting the strategy for the circle. And really, when we talk about strategy in Holacracy, what we're talking about are where are we going? What are the most important things of all the things that we have to do? What are the things that are most important and help us in terms of our own prioritization? We refer to them as prioritization heuristics. So it's giving individual role fillers some data around when they're making their own prioritization decisions. If you have conflict yourself between A and B, you can look to these strategies to see, here's where we're going as a circle. And given those strategies, does it help you resolve A and B? And that's really the other role of the other accountability of the lead link is that.
Yeah, I want to follow up on a couple of things you said. So one was prioritizations first, and then actually all of them, structuring governance, prioritizations, and strategies. But let's start with prioritizations, because I think something that's different with Holacracy, so you move from a manager position to a lead link position, is that as a manager, you might be sort of more proactive with those prioritizations, whereas I think as a lead link, you become more reactive. Yeah. So as an example, I mean, there are a lot, and this is where it's kind of like the Constitution is a great reference guide. It's a pointer to what's there, but it's also not going to train you on how to use this stuff. But there's lots of tools in the Constitution that allow people to resolve their own disputes. So, there are passages of the Constitution that talk about requirements to provide transparency about what you're working on to someone else. So that allows for people to have educated conversations, employees without the manager present, saying like, hey, I'd like you to do this. When can you get it to me by? Well, 3 months. Well, that's not going to work for me. What else is in the way? And that person has a constitutional requirement to have a list of all of their projects and actions or that they're managing in their system and show it to the other person and say, look, here's what's ahead of this. And that way they can have an educated conversation. So it doesn't just become yes or no. It becomes, hey, okay, I see that you have this ahead of this. Why? Or could I explain to you why this is more important to me? Or could I help take something off your plate? There's a lot of negotiation that can happen without the lead link present. But then if they get it, those loggerheads, then as a lead link, that's usually at least when I step in and then I offer the prioritization. If they can't use those other tools of the Constitution to build mutual clarity. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's how it works for you.
yeah, so there are those rules in the Constitution, and which you just articulated. The way I like to think about it is, without having a manager there, or without having mom or dad there to go to, you're essentially, people are left to resolve these things as adults. And it's really, if you ignore the Constitution completely, if there's something you and I, Tara, disagree on, the conversation, an adult conversation is, well, tell me more about your thing so I understand better. And I'll tell you more about my thing, and so you understand it better. And just with that, is that enough to resolve it? If not, well, maybe there's some things we could change in terms of the scope of what you need from me, that could still get you what you need, but doesn't require much work. I mean, these are just adult plain conversations. And I think without having a mom and dad to go to, you create more room and more space for us to have adult conversations. And there's also rules in Holacracy that reinforce that. Yes.
And you've got to understand, as a lead link, you've got to know those rules. So that I've had moments where I've sort of asked for a prioritization without thinking about what's in the way. And I've had my lead link say to me, well, what's competing for your attention? Put it back on me to think about it first, and to have the conversation with the colleague that I'm in conflict with first. First, you guys try to resolve it. What's in the way, have that conversation. And then if there's still, a challenge, then I can get in there with a prioritization. But that's that sort of change, I think, from a manager to a lead link, is understanding, when do I need to step in right away? And when do I actually want to point people to the resources they have to resolve it themselves first.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to get real concrete for people so that they can also take away specific things. And then the other thing that you mentioned was strategy. And I think strategy is one of these terms that I sort of hate, because it can mean so many things to so many people. And some people, when they use the word strategy, they mean, we're going to grow business 30% in the next month, or whatever. That can be a strategy in a conventional management hierarchy, and it's not in Holacracy. So we might want to just pick apart a little bit how strategy itself changes with Holacracy.
Right. I mean, sure. And strategy in a Holacracy context is really something that helps people prioritize their own work. And in fact, the way I approach strategies in my circles is I essentially ask the role fillers, what are the biggest or the hardest prioritization challenges that you have? How do you, what are the things that you often struggle with? I don't know whether this is more important or this is more important. And so I try to sense from the team as to where they have prioritization difficulties, and then develop, quote, strategies that help direct that. And, it's really just about helping people prioritize their own work. That's all it really is. But strategies in GlassFrog, because I'm the circle lead for GlassFrog, we have two strategies there, and one is around making GlassFrog, make it easier to learn Holacracy through it, and the other is to make our data collection and integration of feedback, make that whole system more robust in terms of informing how we prioritize the work and what gets changed in GlassFrog. And those were the areas that people, within the team, as I had conversations with them, were struggling with. And so came up with a couple of strategies that, sort of laid out, here's kind of where our focus should be. And to the degree that you can, try to make decisions that align with this, these eventual outcomes. And it's also, the other thing that tends to happen with strategies in a hierarchical sense is it tends to be a big, itself, a whole project. What's our vision? What's our mission? What are our goals? What are our strategies? What's our, 5-year plan and specific actions? And it's a very, very sort of a crystal ball type of approach to what we should be doing. And in Holacracy, it's a much more sense and respond. And so the strategies we have, you can, as a circle lead, you can set those strategies and then a week later change them because something's changed in the environment. So they're not static at all. And every once in a while, as a circle lead, I'll check with the circle, say, hey, are these strategies still helpful? And if they're not, let's change them to something that's actually helpful in terms of your own prioritization.
Yeah.
I have one friend of mine who in WATEC, we were friends in WATEC, and we've both gone off and done other things. And she was asking me a question recently about strategies, actually, this whole topic. And she's like, oh, I'm having a hard time coming up with a strategic plan. And I said, well, why don't you set a couple of goals and just sense and respond your way there? And yeah, it doesn't have to be hard.
And there are lots of I've seen lots of companies come up with sophisticated, the strategy is just a basic bare bones construct in the Constitution. And then lots of companies have come up with really interesting ways to build on top of it. So I was mentioning that Rosian she talked at the Holacracy Forum last year, talked about using the scaling up methodology, which needed some tweaking actually, because a lot of these strategy methodologies are created within the context of a hierarchy. So there's some ways that they've tweaked it to their context. So there's that. Other companies like Springest in the Netherlands has also used OKRs. And ultimately it's the lead link who's setting the strategy, who's deciding it, unless you change that through governance, which you can. You give it to another role. You can create a process for it. We have a process for it at our company. Some checkpoints maybe on that authority. The process itself, you may, as a lead link, really want to figure out what the best way for getting the information from other people is, so that you don't have to make that decision in a vacuum. And so, like Rosian's thing was a lot about building information from the ground up. And I know Springest does that as well. And we do that as well with the strategy process. So how do you gather information from the people that are sensors so that you can then create, how do you get information from the bottom up so that you can then provide some information top down? I think is one thing to keep in mind. And I think the other thing that is, and I don't want to go into it too much today, but there is a real difference, I think, in how metrics are used in Holacracy. Because in Holacracy, the lead link, at least in version 4.1, we set the metrics, the lead link set the metrics, but that doesn't mean you're setting targets. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I have a couple of reactions to what you just said. The first one with respect to strategies, just to be clear for everyone listening, Holacracy itself does not prescribe a way to develop strategies. It just merely says that they exist, and the lead link has accountability to do that. And so there's a lot of, you're up to your own devices. At WATEC, we use liberating structures to essentially gather, data and sensing from the masses in order to create the strategies, but it's up to you to decide however you want to do it. With respect to metrics is one of my favorite topics, actually. And I have a sort of a love-hate thing with metrics. But in that blog post, which Matt already shared on Leading Through Holacracy, I talk about metrics. And there's several sort of rules and metrics that I keep in mind as I think about metrics. One of them is, just because you can measure it doesn't actually mean it's important. And just because it's important doesn't mean you can measure it. So metrics can be a hard thing. And also, you have to be careful what you measure, because you'll get what you measure. And I have some anecdotes I can share if enough time. But I think the best metrics in a Holacracy system are the metrics. There's really two categories, but the primary metrics are the ones that help answer the question, to what degree are you achieving your purpose? And to what degree are you fulfilling your accountabilities? And I think that's where you should start. So you start at your purpose and ask yourself the question, okay, how do we know if we are achieving our purpose? And try to see if there's some metric that in some way can measure that. And you may not be able to, because like I said, just because it's important doesn't mean you can measure it. And the same thing with accountabilities. How do we know we're actually achieving what's expected of us as a team? And having metrics that focus on that. You can also have another category of metrics, which might be things you're, as a team, you're trying to measure progress. I'll give you an example. In GlassFrog, we've implemented a new user interface, which has been rolling out. At some point, we need to deprecate the older interface. And so we have a metric that we track to see what percentage of people are using the new user interface versus the old one. And that's just a very tactical metric. We'll get to a point where that helps us answer the question when to deprecate, and then we'll get rid of the metric. It's not a strategic metric per se. So, but there's so much more I could say about metrics.
Well, I guess one thing I just want to get in here, because I think it's such a key shift. And when I'm thinking about what are the pitfalls a lot of times for managers stepping into Holacracy, I've seen a lot of companies, when you get into their metrics, that they use them as ways for rewarding or punishing what's happening so far. And I think it's valuable to understand what's happening and decide, are we on track or are we off track? But think within the construct of holacracy, it's really important that metrics provide a focus on transparency, because otherwise you, as you said, you get what you measure. I mean, there are a lot of ways where you can create, perverse incentives by punishing, what's coming up in the metrics. So that's something you really want to be careful about, is that you want to encourage transparency so that you can get the information about what's going on, so that you can resolve it together, rather than, hey, you're not doing what you said you would do. Therefore there will be a consequence for you, which is something I've seen.
Yeah, and you're touching on something, in my opinion, has less to do with holacracy and hierarchy and more to do with the culture of an organization and psychological safety, and to what degree are people, is there safety in talking about things. And the principle in self-management, and particularly in holacracy, is that you make everything as much as possible transparent, so that people have better data to sense and respond to it. And it's not intended to be punitive, and we're all here to try to do a good job. And but sometimes there's things that get in our way, and metrics help us identify that and help inform decisions, particularly data-driven decisions.
I love that you said that too, and we're not going to be able to hit it all, but for me, that's the huge change with holacracy, and also the huge shift that the manager at a lead link needs to make, is really getting to, like, my role is to help facilitate the information coming out. And so that's why as a lead link, you're going to start to shift to a lot more questions instead of directives, because you're really trying to build that transparency and that safety so that things can be resolved mutually, instead of like, I'm going to tell you how it's going to be, and if you're not doing it, then there's some fear about bringing up what's actually going on.
Yeah, and I think another way to talk about that is, from a lead link perspective, part of your role is to ask yourself and answer this question: are we structured properly in order to achieve the purpose and the accountabilities of the circle? And one way to know the answer to that question is have metrics to see, are we able to achieve these things? And if metrics are underperforming in your view, then it's a question about, well, do we have the right governance in place? Is it clear how things should be happening? Is there it starts to set up data to help you answer that question.
Yeah, that's great, Mike. I have so many more questions that I had queued up, but I'm not going to get to, because I want to get to participant questions. But I do want to say that all the stuff that we're not able to sort of fully dig into today, there is a lead link course that we're going to be talking about afterwards, and I think there's a lot more in-depth information. It's a 4-hour course, so there's a lot more information in that course than we're able to cover.
At least 4 times as much as what we've talked about, if not more.
Okay, so I'm going to queue up some of these participant questions. I'm going to select, I'm not necessarily going to go in order, guys. I'm going to select ones that I think might be interesting for us all to hear about. So
can I pause you there for a second, Tara?
Can you what?
Can I pause you for a second?
Sure.
Pitch to prioritize any questions that talk about WATEC outcomes, because I have some data to share there.
Oh my
if
gosh,
you think it's relevant.
Read through all of them real quick. Okay, so okay, there's nothing about there's nothing about that.
Okay.
Okay. Let's start here, because I think this is kind of an interesting question, like chicken and egg between personality and the growth process. There's a question about what personality traits are important in a lead link. And I'm curious to hear what you say about that.
Yeah, I think I've heard this question in multiple variations. Like, is there some people that just can't be a lead link in holacracy? The way I think about it is, and there's maybe a binary answer to this, and then more of a spectrum answer. First answer: if leaders are of the personality of like servant leadership, you can imagine some leaders are servant leaders and others are more directive. And both of those individuals, I think, can be successful in holacracy, but the path to maturity is going to be longer for some of them. If you're a servant leader, the holacracy practice is basically tools to help you do what you've always wanted to do. And you still have to learn it, and there's a learning curve. If you're more of a directive leader, fundamentally, holacracy eliminates any accountabilities around directing people what to do. So you have to, there's just a longer learning curve for those individuals. But I think any individual who aspires to be a leader in an organization that respects other people's authority, they can learn.
And I want to give a shout out here to IGI, one of our providers in France, because the way that they're talking about holacracy now to managers, and Louis, you can clarify this because I see that you're here and there might be others from IGI here, is that it's actually a process for creating better managers. That you're still, and that might be oversimplifying the point, but that you still have leaders that are required to, a different type of leader that's required to help keep the team on track, but you're no longer doing it with that directive frame. And that can be learned through the process of adopting holacracy, but you might be in better shape if you have that orientation already. There's a question here that I will think is great and we should cover. Hey, what about those outcomes? So like.
Okay. Well, so I'll set up a little bit first before I share. So when I began learning at holacracy in WATEC, the problem I was trying to solve was the ability to attract and retain talent, because in that particular institution or organization, half of the workforce was eligible to retire within the next couple of years. And my main responsibility was IT workforce. And we're in the backyard of Microsoft and Google and Amazon. So people coming out of college largely really, would rather work at those companies than work at state government. So that was the strategic challenge that landed on my plate. And so I eventually developed several initiatives. One of them was holacracy, which was really about trying to create a systemic way to create an empowering environment. And the alternative is what I refer to as personality-driven empowerment, where we've all worked for managers that, hopefully, we've all worked for managers that are very empowering, and likewise work for managers that aren't. But that sense of empowerment comes from their personality and not from the system itself. And so I viewed holacracy as potentially a system that can create empowerment. So there were several things that I measured throughout this experiment. I partnered with Harvard Business School researchers as well to collect other data. And this is some summary data that was essentially the outcome of the experiment. And so one of the things, there's 5 pieces here, but one of the things was our ability to make decisions increased 10x, 93% reduction in the time it took to make decisions. And this is the time it took for us to bring up a topic, discuss it, and take some sort of next action or decision on it. Went from an average of 20 minutes down to an average of 2 minutes. And largely where that speed came from was it was much clearer on who had the authority to make those decisions. And so the conversations were really about, what do you need to make that decision? Whereas previously the conversation was about who's going to do this work, and most of us spend our time trying to avoid the work. So that was that one. The second metric was empowerment. And here, as a servant leader before holacracy, I measured this. And I measured this using an agile tool called Fist to 5. And I asked the question at every meeting, to what degree do you feel empowered to resolve your own issues? And people would do a 1 through a 5 in terms of what they perceive as their ability to resolve their own issues. And on average, I was around 60%. It kind of maxed out at 60%. And I just assumed that was, the best I could do. And I tried many things to try to improve that, but it flattened out at 60%. Well, then we adopted holacracy, and then within 6 months, that number grew to 90%. And that was sort of the second data point where I realized that the organizational system itself is a constraint or limiter on the degree in which people feel empowered. It's not just me as a person, it's also the system we're in. Leadership capacity, I've already talked about. Attracting talent, we had jobs we had to fill and et cetera, like everyone else. And I measured our ability to attract talent versus our competitors, which would be other state agencies. And one anecdote I'll share here, which is behind this data point, is we were trying to fill a business analyst position, and one of the candidates was also applying for identical position, identical pay in another agency. And that agency called us and asked us, they told us that, hey, this candidate, also interviewed at your place and interviewed here. And we wanted to know, like what you thought of them. And the person that they spoke to in our office said, well, he was in our top 10. And they said, top 10? How many candidates did you get? Because we got 3. And our response was, well, we got 34. We were consistently attracting more candidates to our jobs because in the job announcements we talked about holacracy and how we do things and how we do work. So it was a significant attractor, and the quality of the candidates is also very high. And then we also tracked to what degree candidates were willing to take a pay reduction relative to their other opportunities in order to work in our environment, and they're willing to take a $15,000 to $20,000 pay cut. One, in fact, left one of these big .com companies I talked about, and left them for a $30,000 pay cut just to work in this environment. So these were some of the outcomes that were a result of implementing these initiatives, including holacracy.
That's awesome. And I want to say you're not the only organization that's experienced that attracting talent thing without sounding too salesy. I know that there's a couple of companies that occur to me just off the top of my head, Springist and Hyperport, that have made holacracy part of their identity, and it's helped them, in sort of attracting talent. I want to move on to a question that I think is really kind of in your wheelhouse because it's the heart of what you were hitting at with that blog post.
Okay.
It's from Pavel. I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, so excuse me if I just butchered it. We have an organization that did not have managers or much hierarchy, only 3 founders, and lead links were mostly chosen as the most active team members. Here's the question. There's no problem with letting go of power, but actually being afraid to be perceived as a manager. Do you have experience with those organizations, and what can you advise to the beginner lead links in such a question?
Yeah, I think, this speaks to what I said earlier, which is there's 2 behaviors that happens when you shift to self-management. And one behavior is that you just continue doing the way you're doing things in terms of managers and directing people. The other way is you really back way off in terms of leadership and quote managing. And both of those are natural and common, and both of those are wrong. The best, and that's sort of a natural thing, and so that's okay. But the next action is to learn how to lead in holacracy, learn the tools, learn what's actually your accountability in as a lead link, as a circle lead, and also learn what's not your accountability. That's equally, if not more important, is to know what you're not accountable for, because there will be a lot of projections on those leaders. A lot of, you're accountable for this, and the reality is you're not actually. It's other people that are, as much as you have to learn how to let go of power, other people are learning how to take power and how to own their power. So, you're sort of competing with that. You're trying to reinforce the fact that certain authority and power belongs actually in those roles that other people fill. So I think the thing to do is to know, and this is one of the nice things about holacracy, the system, is it's very explicit about what it is you can do to lead in that environment, and just know those things. And that blog post is those 4, I talk about the 4 main levers that I think of. There's actually more levers, and Chris goes into a lot more detail in that course, but it's, learning and understanding what those are and what those boundaries are will help you.
Yeah, and I don't think it's like a one-off. It's a learning process of learning how to step in to that leadership position over time.
I've been doing this for 5 years and I'm still learning. So it's holacracy is the beginning of a leadership development.
Here's an interesting question. There's a few questions here about getting started. Here's one that I think relates to your experience at WATEC. How did you do the initial structuring? And I don't know this. Was it you? Did you involve your team members? Did you work with H1? How did you get to your starting point? For your initial structure.
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer a slightly different question. I'm
Go for
it. And I'm thinking about my role as the holacracy advisor. I often get calls from companies that ask me the question, how do we get started? And the very first question you have to answer is, why are you doing this? What is it about holacracy that, what problem are you trying to solve that you think holacracy is going to solve? Or what opportunity are you going after that you think holacracy is going to enable you to do? And you have to have a really good concrete answer to that question, first and foremost, before you worry about constructuring and all those sorts of things. Because this is going to be hard, and you need something, you need this sort of anchor to remind you why you're doing this. And if you're a leader in an organization, you also have to have a good answer for all the employees that are coming to you. Like, why are we doing this? What is this? It's just this another, fad of the month. And so you have to have a good answer for those kinds of questions to keep you grounded and to keep you focused on, through those hard times. Now, in terms of the structuring, the way, I'm trying to recall how we did this, because it was a number of years ago now, but no, the way we did the structuring, and I'm not saying this is the way you have to do the structuring, but the way we did the structuring is we had coaches come in, work with each team, and we quickly capture at least one role per person for those teams. And at some level, it doesn't matter how you start, because it's just the start. It's just the anchor in the sand, and whatever you come up with is going to be wrong. So accept that it's not going to be right, and you just create a starting point and you iterate past that to make it less wrong.
And you don't try to be activist and do a whole reorg in your initial structuring, because I think
in fact, I'm working with a client now they're in the midst of getting ready to do reorg, and I said, please, don't do that before you adopt Holacracy. Do it on or after the date we launch, and use Holacracy as the lever to implement that.
And it's crazy how common that is. I mean, it just seems like it is always kind of one of those big first traps, but it's really important because Holacracy is so disruptive. You don't want to create the disruption of Holacracy and the disruption of, hey, you're on a whole new team now with whole other, you want to try to keep it as close to how it feels now,
right?
So that then people can understand how to use the levers of Holacracy to help you do that reorg.
Yeah, I mean, adopting something like Holacracy is really, it's 80% an organizational change management type of initiative.
Right.
And, it's, like you said, as you launch Holacracy, it's good to start from a foundation of at least something is familiar. So at least I have my role and my team, at least that's familiar. But there are some challenges when you first launch. I mean, just the whole question around no more managers, quote, no more managers, and the sort of potential fear and drama that creates in an organization, not only in the management layer, like what the heck, am I not important anymore? But also the employee layer. It's like, yay, I don't have a boss I have to pay attention to anymore. There's a lot of, like 90% not really understood. And people, and it just takes time to kind of work through what is the truth of that change. And, commingling that with a whole bunch of reorg is bad.
And there's a question that we don't really have time to fully address because we're, running into, but it's this question about, what do you minimum Holacracy elements? And what I want to, emphasize that you're doing a lot now in the engagement that you work with, and this is something that I try to emphasize when I talk to people about Holacracy, is how much about this change management is required. Communication with employees, training and capacitation for people. You cannot send the Constitution to people and expect them to learn the whole Holacracy that way. It's a reference guide. And people need to have some way of understanding what the new expectations are and how to step into those roles. Could you talk a little bit more about that when you're getting started?
Yeah, when I talk to companies that are thinking about Holacracy, I usually tell them there's 3 critical success factors that will increase the probability of your success. So one is leadership that really has to buy into it. They can articulate why they're doing it and, is really willing to cede their authority. So that's one. The second is the willingness to invest in the workforce and the training. Practitioner training is an example, is a key example. In my organization, I was able to provide practitioner training to half of the organization. And 4 years later.
First practitioner training.
Yeah.
Four day. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the 4-day class. We did it on site, and we had half the workforce go through that training. 4 years later, I could tell who went through that training and who hadn't. So the amount of capacity and understanding of this system was significantly created through that type of training. And so I think that's a second critical success factor, is that you have some critical mass, as many as you possibly can afford to go through that practitioner training. And the third is, and this is going to sound like a pitch, but it's, be willing to invest in outside resources. And the main reason there is because so much of learning this kind of system is learning new habits. And there's so many things that just, you're not going to see that in the Constitution, but so many things that you don't know what you don't know. And you need some outside expertise who can recognize bad habits and what are the good, right habits, and help you through that transition. So, I mean, those are the three critical success factors. And I think to your point, Tara, the one around investing in the workforce is, that's the second one.
Yeah.
And I think if you cut yourself short in any of those three, your probability of success goes down greatly.
And there are ways to do that in more or less economical ways, right? I mean, you can invest in full-scale coaching for all of your, all of your circles, or, you can invest in getting an experienced coach for one of your circles, start there, and then build the capacity within that circle so that those people then become the ambassadors for the rest
Right.
of the organization.
Yeah, particularly large organizations, I recommend that they start with a department or a team that, would most likely really, this kind of system would resonate with them, and build that internal capacity up front before they replicate it out through the rest of it. And it's for several different reasons, not only to build that capacity, but then other people can observe and what's going on there and get, better answers to what is this thing, because they can see it firsthand. So yeah, there's definitely, incremental ways to adopting this while still adhering to those three critical success factors.
And I think it's a good bridge to I'm sorry guys, there's so many more questions here that I would love to be able to get to, but for the interest of time, I'm just going to start moving into a closing kind of phase, which is like, we'll be sharing a few things after, sending out a few things to you guys, including Mike's blog post, which is a good resource. There are free resources for getting your team educated. You can check out Mike's blog post. You can check out Chris Cowan's blog post. They're also we're trying to find ways to help you build capacity with a lower cost. So there is, we're rolling out these suite of online courses. We have them right now in English, but we're planning to sort of internationalize and get them into other languages as well. And the one that is coming up that's related to what we're talking about today is the LeadLink course, although we also have a practitioner fundamentals packet of courses, which will be sometime in 2020, to just be courses on all of the different, Deb's asking, where are they? The online courses are not free. There are free blogs on Medium. The online courses are paid courses. And we'll be sending out links to those. But yeah, that's one way, I guess, that you could also build some capacity within your team. But thanks, Matt, for sharing that. But regardless of whether you do an online course or you do something else, I just think the key thing is really thinking about how you are going to build capacity. How are you going to deal with the meetings? And how are you going to deal with outside of the meetings, building this capacity to practice holacracy? Because otherwise, you're not really going to get the benefit of practicing holacracy. As Mike said, you'll have people that are sort of still using another way of working within this holacracy environment. So thanks for sharing those. Any closing words that you want to share, Mike, or anything else that we didn't hit that you want to hit in this last few moments?
There's so much. I think, I guess what I might try to share, make up on the fly here, is some sense of inspiration. Particularly for leaders out there, I'll speak to leaders in particular, that for me, I made that choice to no longer work in a hierarchical organization. And it was because I discovered that I could have greater leadership capacity in a non-hierarchical sense. I also observed and felt that it was a more respectful way of working with people, and I saw many examples where people were essentially liberated by the system and just did phenomenal things. And it almost brings a tear to my eye to not only see that, but also recognize how caged up and constrained and sort of confined they were before. And that sort of that inspires me to it's what excites me, Tara, actually, when going to work with clients, is to try to find those people and liberate those diamonds in the rough, and just out of good of humanity. But anyway, that's all I have to offer at the moment.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for your time here today. Thanks, Mike. This was a lot of fun. I always love chatting with you about this stuff, nerding out on holacracy stuff and hearing about your experience at WATEC. And we'll be sending out that follow-up information to you guys. So we hope it's been useful. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Tara.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.